of any expression and handling a logic. Now what should happen is the result of expression, and the logic that derived an output. The result of expression and the logic that derived as output, that derived any output. So must be stored in a reference, must be stored in a reference, and written as a response. That is a very big point. That means generally the first question here is, usually functions will perform a functionality. After performing the functionality, they evaluate values. Whatever the values they evaluate, those values need to be stored in a reference, so that we can use those values and present as output, send as response, you can say that. That means actually functions will do a functionality and return the values, but the returned values need to be stored in another reference. We have to create a reference. That means you have to create a reference for storing the values evaluated by expressions in a function, So you have to create a reference for storing the values evaluated by expressions in a function. Actually, technically, a function is defined with return type. A function is defined with return type. In order to use the function as a reference for storing values. This is the key point. Function is defined with return type in order to use the function as a reference for storing the values. Usually, function is being used to evaluate a value. That evaluated value must be stored in a reference and it needs to be presented as an output. That means you need an explicit reference. But when you define a function with a return type, that means you are telling that the function is being used as a reference. That means you see variable as a data type. Variable is defined with a data type. That means you are declaring a memory which can store this particular type of value. That means you are creating a reference for memory where you can store this type of value. And you are saying that a function also now will have a data type. What does that mean? It means that a return type, that it means that now the function can be used as a reference for storing this type of value. That means if I don't define this, that means now the function is used to just perform a functionality. But function cannot be used as a reference for storing the values. A function cannot store the value. A function can handle the values, evaluate the values. But the evaluated values of function cannot be stored in any reference. You have to create a new reference and store the values. And why you are defining function with a return type here? Function you are defining with a return type. That means you are telling that The function itself can be used as a reference to store the values evaluated by that function. I hope everyone is clear with this point. That means a function is used as a reference now, so that the values it evaluates can be stored in the same function reference. The values can be stored in the same function reference. That is the intention of creating a function. So that means without creating other references for handling the values of function, we can use function itself as a reference for storing the values by defining return type. If you don't want function, that means this is very important. If we don't want a function, to be used as a reference for storing the values, then you can define it as void. You can define it as void. That means if you define as void, already I told you, actually void is an operator. It is a special type of operator actually in JavaScript and TypeScript. In JavaScript and TypeScript, void is not a keyword. New is an operator. Void is also an operator. The void operator is to indicate that the function is not being used as a reference. Void is used to indicate that it is not being used as a reference for storing value. So that means void means, generally when you ask what is void, immediately people will say no return type. And if you ask why you are using void as type, we are using void as type to tell the function that it is not being used as any reference for storing value. Void means no value. That means actually the concept of void means it is not used as a reference for storing the value. It is not intended to store any value. So if you don't want any function to be used as a reference for storing the values, then you can define it. As void. That is very important. Define as void. So technically here, when we are defining the function, so we have a function and a function name. Suppose the function name is some captcha, that is the function name. And captcha is a function. And here we defined the function as void. So without any reference type, return type defined. So generally we say that void will not return anything. Actually the point is void is indicating that now the function will not be used as a reference. So what here I am doing is, in this captcha, I am writing a simple reference like this. In the captcha, we are writing like this. So I am declaring, so let a, it is a number type is equal to math.random. So math.random is used to generate a random number. A random number is generated. But actually random numbers will usually start. Math is a JavaScript mathematical object. So it will provide several mathematical functions and properties which you can use in your applications. And this math object has random, which returns a random number. Usually random number starts with 0.78. That's the reason we will use multi